welcome everybody to this week's drop-in session. We've got we're really excited to welcome Analyze today. So Robin Brink from Analyze Consulting to tell us a little bit more about how Analyze have been using our Quantify module in customer projects. And I think Robin's going to share a little bit more about an approach that Analyze have developed around collecting that information and making sense of it and using it in Spark. So just a quick note on Analyze. Analyze Consulting are a partner, Netcall partner. They're a leading business management consultancy specializing in strategic advisory, process optimization, and change leadership. And Robin, who I'm really pleased to welcome today, is a senior consultant at Analyze, and she's going to be taking us through the presentation. This session today is a little bit longer than we've added an extra 10 minutes onto the session today, just to make sure that we can sort of cover the topic and any questions. So again, for those of you who've just joined since we started, if you could go on to mute during the session, probably best if you turn cameras off just to make sure we get the best bandwidth for this. And if you have questions as we go through, could you please pop them into the chat, and then we'll do is we'll pick the questions up at the end. So on that note, I'll hand over to Robin, and welcome to our drop-in.
Fantastic. Thanks for the introduction, Craig. Let's jump right in. So just at a high level, what I plan on covering in today's session. Firstly, I will give a bit of a background on Analyze as a consultancy, as well as the client that we performed this project for. Although I think, Craig, you have given us quite a bit of a background, so I will focus primarily on the client there. And then onto the project's problem statement, and then the why behind why we did this project. A summary of the project and the outcomes, and then really going into what our approach was and a breakdown of each of the steps within our approach, and then the conclusion. So I know we've extended the session a little bit today. Hopefully I'll be able to get through all of my content and we can have a robust Q&A session. So I'm not going to touch on the Analyze bit of this. I think, Craig, you've done a good job there. But for the client's background, our client, we're keeping them anonymous in the situation, but effectively they are a South African health insurance provider, and they offer a range of medical aid options to suit diverse needs and budgets. They operate under a larger financial group, and really what they do is they administer medical insurance in South Africa. It's called medical aid within different schemes. So in South Africa, you legally cannot truly make money off of medical aid. How money is made is through administering medical aid. So performing all of the administration tasks at the back end of the medical aid. And in this project, you know, the focus is really on things such as management of diseases, claims management, billing, and managing their members, really. So that's just a bit of a background. We can't really disclose too much about our client, but now onto the problem statement. So as I said, the client has several medical aid schemes for which they provide administration services, and they've recently moved one of their schemes onto a new system. And as part of that migration, Analyze was tasked with documenting the updated processes. So generally within this organization, there was very limited experience with the Analyze and the Spark tool. So they had sort of very outdated processes, and they had not worked with the tool before we came to them, and there were no baseline metrics for any of the processes that had been mapped within Spark. Just going a level deeper, once they had moved the scheme onto the new system, they found that they needed to hire, I think it was in total 20 more employees just to perform the basic tasks that they had been performing on the old system. So there was a lot of question around why that was happening, Are the processes different? Effectively, the new system should have just been an update to the old system. So there was a lot of questions around that coming from the client. And the opportunity here was both on a process side and a quantification side, really around retaining critical information within the organization, within the process repository. So really establishing a repository filled with accurate processes for them, and then adapting more complex processes as the organization grows, and then enabling continuous improvement by establishing that baseline for their map processes and helping them to optimize staffing levels by determining the FTE requirements. So this project had two parts, and the two parts are both equally important. So the first part was actually creating a baseline measure for certain prioritized processes that had been mapped so that we could identify opportunities for improvement, and then to actually upskill the team members to use Spark, be able to map processes, and also be able to quantify processes as time went on. So one thing we've seen in our time and motion studies is that a lot of companies are viewing gathering time data within a time and motion study as a once-off activity. And this is really not helpful. You map a process, you gather the data, and then 6 months from now, management wants to make a decision on data that is 6 months old. Things have changed within the process, staffing has changed, and so those numbers are really outdated. And the key thing here is empowering, in our case, our clients to not just do quantification once, to not gather data once, but actually make it a part of how they do business. So really those two parts of our approach and the outcome that we wanted are really important. So here's the why, although I do feel that I'm probably preaching to the choir on this, but why is it important to quantify processes and then also bring in the Spark adoption to that as well? So obviously, optimization of the process, by analyzing each step of the task, each task in the process, you can identify redundancies, unnecessary actions, streamline operations and improve the workflows. We can identify bottlenecks within each process, find out where we are particularly slow and work on those areas. We have improved time management. So really it's about sharing what we're finding with teams to equip them to better use their time to effectively execute on processes. Strategic planning, so something that was really important to the client, revealing long-term trends in workplace performance and helping management to make strategic decisions when it came to workforce planning, and then obviously the staffing level. So to understand how much capacity they have, how many processes, how many iterations of each process, and really help them to better understand, firstly, why the shift happened and how they can adjust and optimize their staffing levels going forward. And like I've said, adopting Spark is about constant improvement. This cannot be something that is done once off and months from now we want to use that data. It really does have to become part of an ongoing effort to optimize processes. Okay, great. So onto the project summary. This really was a time and motion project with the end result of us using the Quantify feature within Spark. And during our time and motion study, we managed to perform 30 plus observations covering more than 80 tasks. And we gathered 65 plus hours of observation data and over 500 data points. Now, we had a relatively small project team. There were 2 full-time members on our team and 3 part-time members. And those being observed, the employees being observed, were spread across the country, primarily in Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg in South Africa. And like I mentioned previously, we covered managed care, claims, membership, and billing. So with that many data points and hours observed, how did the team possibly do it? And I think that takes us to our approach. So the approach I have shown here is really our standard approach to time and motion studies. So what I'll do is I'll go over the approach at a high level, and then I plan on going through each step in our approach and breaking down the specific project context for that step, what we did, and then some lessons learned and some recommendations that came out of it. So our approach at a high level is first to update the processes that will be quantified. Like I said, this project focused on processes that were prioritized, so things that were really important to the client, specifically related to the scheme and the tasks that were allocated to the new employees that had to join due to resourcing constraints. Then we had to identify individuals to observe, schedule those observations, complete the observations, gather data, review the gathered data, and then analyze the captured data. So it's really simple. I think anyone who's done a time and motion study will agree that this approach is fairly standard. And then throughout our approach, we really had upskilling the client team as something that underpinned every last bit of this. So it was something that ran in parallel to the time and motion studies throughout the course of the project. So on to the first point, the updating of the processes to be quantified. So the situation here, the processes that needed to be quantified were completed on a previous project by another project team. So the project team that completed the time and motion studies was not the same project team that had actually sat and mapped the processes with the client. And then the map processes were quite complex with several levels and decision points. So they were really not simple processes. I think at certain points, the processes went into 5 or 6 levels of detailed view. So really, really complex processes that were mapped. And for the time and motion study project, significant process updates were out of scope for the project. We did not have time to rework all of the processes that had already been mapped. And so under execution, the team identified key processes on the lowest levels to be included in scope, and we split processes where required. So things that we learned at this point was that ideally the same team should be mapping processes and quantifying the processes or performing a time and motion study on those processes. I think getting an understanding of the processes before you quantify them is really, really important. This actually took the team quite a while for us to get comfortable with the processes, comfortable with the client, before we could really start making progress. Other things to be noted is that processes need to be quantified at the lowest level. So when we perform quantification in Spark, it's really about adding durations at a task level. And as we roll up the detailed views, that task durations will roll up as well. So it's really important that we do everything at the lowest level possible. And also when it comes to decisions, you want to minimize decision points in your processes. And this is really important because every task will be added up as it is. So if you have a decision point and you've said the one task takes 5 minutes to do, the other task takes 10, typically only one of those tasks will take place, it will still roll up to 15. So it's really important to work at the lowest level, really simple processes with minimized decision points. And then the other part of it is that the tasks need to actually be specific and measurable. So an example of this is if a client submits a claim and the agent assessing that claim is unsure about the information that is given, you don't want to have a task that says engage with the client. That's very vague. It doesn't have a start and an end. You need to really be specific. So it could be something like call the client, and then we can actually start before the call takes place in the dialing, and we can end it once that call is complete and the agent gathers the data that they need. So you really have to make sure that your tasks are specific and measurable. Otherwise, you'll have to rework processes prior to the optimization, prior to gathering data. And then moving on to identify individuals to observe. So as I said, the project team was not part of the process mapping workshops, and we were not familiar with employees at the client that were involved in performing the processes. So what we did was we identified department leads who are responsible for sort of processes at a higher level and asked them to nominate team members for observation. So one thing that came out of this is that a lot of the department leads, when you ask them for employees to observe, they're very quick to hand you their top performers who meet KPIs and do everything as fast as possible while still making sure all the client's needs are met. But that's not really a reality of what is happening on the ground. So it's really important to include individuals with a range of performance levels. Even though the department leads or the managers may not want that, you have to insist on getting that range and insist on the transparency when it comes to that. Otherwise, the data that is gathered will be the absolute best case and not a true reflection of what is happening on the ground. Great. So moving on to scheduling the observations. So the employees that were identified for us to observe were scattered across the country, and the project team was primarily based in Johannesburg, which posed the question of how were we going to actually do these observations. We took a bit of a risk, a chance, and decided to use Microsoft Teams as our main platform for performing observations. And one of the great things about this was that we could actually perform multiple observations at the same time. So where previously we would be limited by the number of people that we had on the team, physically observing someone completing a task, using Teams was really effective because we could have multiple Teams calls happening at the same time to gather lots of data. And something that I just want to note here is that often when it came to scheduling the meetings, is that individuals may be responsible for certain tasks within an overall process, but they're typically not doing a process end to end. So when it came to scheduling, we actually had to schedule it at task level to say, great, maybe on Thursdays, someone prepares all the reports for the week. So they're doing maybe 10 tasks over 4 different processes. And that's when we would set the time. So you really are working at a task level rather than a process level. So just to keep that in mind when you are scheduling your observations. So the next part is then completing the observation. So the situation here is that outside of a small number of tasks, such as the reporting that I've just mentioned, there were very few tasks that were predictable. So if you again think about the claims process, an agent can't predict a claim coming in, and they also can't predict the complexity of a claim coming in. So often it would be, we've set the time and fingers crossed that we're going to get the information that we need during that time. So on the execution there, the team arranged extended observation sessions. So I've documented it here as lasting over 4 hours. I think sometimes we even stretched that to almost an entire day. And then what we had is that the team member, one of our team members, would join each session at the beginning of the session, really only spending about 5 to 10 minutes there, reiterating the purpose of the observation and confirming with the person being observed exactly what we would like to observe during this time. And then we would leave the call. And in some cases, that individual may stay on that call all day, sharing their screen and narrating what they're doing when they're doing a task that is relevant to us. But in most cases, they would pop in and out of the call depending on when a task came up. So if they were a call agent, they got a new claim in, we needed to capture them, initializing the claim on the system. As soon as they knew a claim was coming in, they'd start sharing their screen, perform the task, talk us through it, and then drop off the call again. And so we got enough data, but not the full day, which is really great in most cases. One thing, and that's particularly applicable for ourselves as consultancies, as we're not in-house, is that if there are different instances of Microsoft Teams, so for us, ourselves, and then the client side, we need to ensure that permissions are set up to allow for the recording as well as the sharing of the meetings, because there's absolutely no value if you're capturing hours and hours of observations, but you don't have access to those after the fact. Great. And then on to what I would say is probably the toughest part of it, which is that the gathering of the data. So the project team was not familiar with the tasks being observed or the systems to carry them out. Again, speaks to the first point around understanding the processes. So again, once we started going through the recordings, it was like, wow, we actually need to spend some time with the team to unpack what is happening there. And again, another learning curve, taking a bit longer. But effectively, we reviewed each recording and recorded the start and end times of all the tasks being observed. This step was the most time consuming. So we had a limited team and a lot of data that needed to go through. I think the team watched a lot of recordings at a, 2x speed, 3x speed where possible, once they got a hang of the different tasks and what they looked like. So yeah, this was very, very interesting. At the end of the project, our recommendation to the client, and we didn't use this at the time, was potentially using what we were calling self-observation. So where an individual would themselves capture their start and end times, and then as a check, you could still do a screen recording so that you could do some sort of checks to make sure that times were captured accurately and people weren't, boosting their durations to make themselves look good. So that was something that we did recommend to the client to try. And then just to note here that the data was captured on Excel and that we use Spark task IDs as reference. So I know Spark has quite a detailed referencing with IDs for tasks and processes. So that was used throughout our data gathering. And then we moved on to reviewing the gathered data. Now, this is very much an optional step, but we know that time and motion studies are inherently prone to human error just because of the nature of them. You have human beings starting and stopping, observing another human being. And that, coupled with the fact that the team was not very familiar with the processes, meant that we wanted to just do a double check on everything that was captured. So the data collection method also helped us to do that. We had the recordings, they were there. And so a second person would come in, have the recording and do spot checks just to make sure that the times captured again were accurate. And like I said before, the step is completely optional. For us, we felt it was important because of the nature of the project, but it just depends on your team's familiarity with what was being observed. And then the last step was around analyzing the capture data. So when you're in Spark and you're adding a duration to a task, you can only add a single duration to each of the tasks, as you can see here. So we have then, in most cases, captured several durations for each task. So we then had to make sure that we got an average amount that was fair and actually reflected what was going on. If there was any extreme anomalies, we would remove them just to make sure that the data captured was realistic. And then, just depending on the number of observations done for each task, depending on your project, some analysis may need to be performed before plugging the values into Spark. And then I've just noted here that following this final step, the client then went on to add the hourly rate per role, as well as all the information needed to perform the simulation. Our client was very resistant to share particularly the hourly rates with us. There was a lot of concern around that. So we ultimately left that to the client, upskilled them in how to do it, and allowed them to run those iterations as they needed. And then onto the upskilling the client. So really, they're focusing on enabling the client to continue mapping and improving their processes. Just 3 quick points here. We had always on training. So as analyzed, we developed training paths for both basic and advanced Spark functions, and we incorporated existing content from Netcall. So the existing video content, some of these drop-in sessions, we incorporated it and created those training paths for our client. And that was then made available to the client's team, and they could complete it at their own pace, obviously within a set duration. And that also enabled us to track So there were cases where the client's team, were not doing things as fast as we needed them to. And so we could take that up and escalate that as required. The next step here is really that practice makes perfect. So making sure that everyone who was being trained had access to a folder on their workspace to practice using the tool and to become familiar with it. And the training also included examples that they had to complete and then would be reviewed by our team just to make sure that they are actually hitting all those skill targets that we've set for them. And then we had hands-on handovers. So we had several handover sessions held with the client's team over a period of a couple of weeks. And we went through in detail each step of the approach and all of the deliverables that were completed as part of the project in detail. So it really wasn't about, here's your baseline, you've done the training, just go ahead and do it. It was about walking a journey with them to make sure that they were comfortable and actually ready to take it on. Because I think it's easy to put down, a baseline and some training, and then we as a consultants leave and hope for the best. We did not want them to walk away from the tool itself, and we did not want them to stop quantifying their processes. So it was really about properly walking the journey with them, making sure that they had enough time to understand every part of it, allocate team members, and set up a way of doing things beyond the project itself. So on to my conclusion. Process optimization is not a once-off activity. I think there's one thing you take out of this. I would love it to be that. And then just a reminder that before you start baselining, if process quantification is part of the future process optimization efforts, it is important to ensure that the map processes are straightforward and consistently structured, that tasks are well thought out, that decision points are minimized. It's really about taking that process quantification mindset into the process mapping at the start already to make sure that you're set up for the most success for your process quantification. And then during baselining, I would encourage you to explore innovative methods for collecting and analyzing data. In our case, we took a risk, it did pay off, but don't be limited by traditional time and motion study methodology. And in our case, we managed to perform these observations on employees around the country with a small team based in Johannesburg. So it's really about thinking creatively there and ensuring that you actually upskill the team in Spark too. Those two things have to go together. And then after the baselining, it's enabling the teams to continue collecting data needed and to further improve their processes. So that is it from my side. I think we have 10 minutes left for some Q&A. Craig, I think I did a good job on the timing.
That was perfect, Robin. Thank you so much. And it was really, really interesting as well.